Drones hitting the Kremlin in an apparent assassination attempt. Putin says no one has attacked Moscow since 1942. Those are ominous words. Reports are that his nuclear arsenal is at its highest readiness that we've seen so far. And also reports that Ukraine has started its quote-unquote spring offensive, or I should say NATO has started its spring offensive, that coming from the Wagner Group. We are honored. We are honored tonight to have on the host of the Duran, Alexander Mercouris, who is, I can't believe we haven't had on the show yet, but I thought, what an opportune moment to have a great thinker, a great analyst, really a person who can help us cut through the fog of war and the propaganda. Alexander, it's my honor to have you here on Redacted.
Well, it is my honor to be here on Redacted, and thank you very much for your very, very generous words.
Well, my pleasure. So I thought what a great place to start is with sort of the 30,000 foot level of where we're at right now, which is this attack, of course, over the past 48 hours on the Kremlin, the talk of nuclear war, the readiness of the nuclear arsenal, the spring offensive. What are your sources telling you? What is your analyst mind telling you about the moment we are in right now?
I think this is an incredibly dangerous moment. And I think whatever it was that happened around the Kremlin, and I'm not convinced, by the way, it was exactly an assassination attempt. It looks like a kind of stunt more than anything. It might also have been intended to knock the Russian flag down from the Kremlin. The building it struck is the building where the Russian flag flies over the Kremlin. But that, of course, is of enormous symbolic significance to Russians, because the part of the Kremlin that is attacked is a building known as the Senate building. And it's the building that, in Russian terms, is the nearest approximation or equivalent to the White House. It's where Russian leaders, since Lenin's day, have had their office. Lenin had his office there, Stalin has his office there, Khrushchev did, Yeltsin did, Putin does. So they've all worked from there. So it's this most famous building in the Kremlin, and it's the one, as I said, which flies the Russian flag. So imagine if a drone hit the White House, either coming close to striking the office of the president, the Oval Office, and the office that Putin uses is as famous to Russians as the Oval Office is to Americans. Stalin used it. Other people have used that same building, that same room. Or if they struck the American flag on the White House. I mean, it would be an enormous event for Americans. This is an enormous event for Russians. And of course, a lot of Russians are very, very angry. And they're taking some of the anger out on their own government. They're saying you're being too weak, you're being too soft, you're not responding strongly enough. You need to take very, very strong countermeasures. Indeed, Ukrainians, and everybody assumes it was the Ukrainians, wouldn't have done that without the support of the West. We are clearly at war with the West. We are a nuclear power. Why are we taking all this from the Americans, from the West, in the way that we are? So it's a dangerous moment. And up to now, and I know this is something that is contrary to what we hear always in the West, Putin has been a voice of relative restraint in this. He has wanted to keep the war contained in Ukraine. So almost certainly he doesn't welcome all this language, but the pressure on him is growing.
So then the response, and I think we see this in some of the reports today about the nuclear arsenal readiness, the movements there, the words of the Wagner founder saying, you know, look, we're seeing signs that these troop movements, drone movements, train movements, for all of this is coming to a head now. What is your analyst mind and sources telling you about some sort of a Russian response? And you're right about that restraint. I think we've seen I think there's always this expectation that we're suddenly going to see a massive retaliation from Putin, almost immediate, like he's some sort of mad. That's what the West wants, right? Is this like mad idea that he's Mad Vlad, right? And that's what's going to happen. But it's also sort of quiet, and then it's precise. What do you think is going to happen?
I think you're absolutely right about this. Now, the important fact, Putin, the Russian government, held news of this attack back for 10 hours. So they clearly wanted to keep this thing under a great deal of information control. They wanted to control the release of this information. They wanted to prepare their responses. They wanted to calm the situation down as much as possible. They didn't want pictures to appear immediately on Russian television, as it can do, showing this attack. So I think Putin is going to want to exercise restraint again, despite the criticism he is coming under. And I think that he believes, and I think that the Russian political leadership, most of them believe, not all of them, and that's an important thing to remember, but most of them believe that in terms of the conflict in Ukraine, things are going their way. So they don't need to overreact. They can take time. They can choose their time to respond. And I don't think, as a result of that, we're going to see missile strikes on Kiev, people hunting Zelensky down, all of those dramatic things that one might have expected. I think the Russians will bide their time. I think that they will undertake a measured response. I think they will also try to put the United States on the back foot. They're already saying the United States is implicated in this because it is supporting this regime, as they call it, in Kiev, which is doing all of these things. And how reckless and irresponsible is that of the United States? And they're also conveying that same message to their friends around the world. And as we've seen, they're not without friends around the world. And they're going to say, look, we're the people who are rational, we're restrained, we don't want to escalate this, but the Americans, they are not being responsible. And they're going to use that in that kind of way to gain more support around the world, even more support at a time when the United States is again seeking to isolate them. But that is what Putin wants to do. The problem is, and I'm glad you mentioned Wagner, because of course there are the hardliners in Russia. Russia has its hardliners. Yevgeny Prigozhin, who is the head of the Wagner Group, is a hardliner increasingly. He's becoming very vocal. He's talking about treason all across the Russian military system, that people are weak. He interprets every exercise of restraint as proof of corruption, and that those voices are getting louder and they're gaining traction. So Putin, I think, still has the authority to keep this under control. But it would be very, very reckless to assume that he can do this indefinitely.
Fascinating. And we just, got word, of course, today from the office of Putin that they're blaming Washington for this attack on the Kremlin, which is not a surprise. Which is not a surprise to any of us who've been following this for any length of time. Everything that's really been directed out of Ukraine has been directed by NATO and the United States, so that's not a surprise. And you're hearing increasing calls from the United States Senate. We heard from from members of the House of Representatives in the United States. We heard from Mike McCall of Texas saying that they have to launch a spring offensive, that our support, the United States support of Ukraine, is really contingent upon them almost pulling off a public relations move, right?
Yes, that's exactly right. And I think, again, this is incredibly irresponsible because everybody who I take seriously, and there's lots of people, there's lots of commentaries about this war, but most people who have been following this war closely feel that time is working against Ukraine, that it's suffering heavy losses in manpower, heavy losses in equipment. It doesn't have a functioning air force to any great extent. Its air defense system is shot to pieces. Its economy is in free fall. There was a very, very sad article in The Guardian, which is very supportive of Ukraine in this war, to put it mildly, but they were talking about the spread of poverty in Ukraine. And despite all of that, Ukraine is in effect being ordered by people in Washington to launch an offensive, which I think most military people that I've spoken to, on both sides, on the American side, I speak to some people who've been in the American military, on the Russian military, they think that it will leave Ukraine in a weaker position. Ukraine might conceivably gain some ground, but the losses it will suffer will be irreplaceable. And today, a Russian commander, a man called Alauddin, who's actually a Chechen, but he's very prominent in the Russian military, he actually said, this is going to be their last big throw. After we weather this, we will continue what we are doing at the moment. We will continue to grind them down. We will continue our attrition, and we are looking for victory. We will achieve our total victory. And he's even put a date on it. He says August to September 2024, they'll have finally run out of everything that they have. And note the timing of that, just a few months or weeks before the presidential election in the United States. And that is not a coincidence, in my opinion.
Fascinating. Yes, I think you're absolutely right about that. I'll get you out of here on these last few points here, which is around personnel and who's left and what are your numbers. We hear a lot of conflated numbers, fake numbers being thrown around by the West about casualties and the number of Ukrainian soldiers who have been killed, who's left. We see these videos of these conscriptions, these Ukrainian conscriptors going around pulling people out of university classes, throwing them into the meat grinder. Who is going to carry out this spring offensive? What forces do they have left to even marshal this?
Right, now, numbers is an impossible game because nobody's giving out numbers that can be taken at all seriously. The Pentagon has also, in these leaked documents, they've admitted that any numbers they're getting, they have very low confidence in. If they have low confidence in them, we shouldn't place much confidence in them either. The one thing we can say is this. Everybody, all the information that's coming out of Ukraine now is that the country has suffered enormous losses. You see photos of cemeteries with flags, full of flags of people who've been killed. You hear lots of stories about people who've been wounded, and there are anecdotal reports. And when I say anecdotal, I mean anecdotal reports from people in the know in the United States, military people who are in contact with Ukraine, that the professional army built up over 8 years by the US and the West from 2014, that most of those people who made up that army are either dead or wounded and have only limited ability to go on conducting the war. And there are also reports now that things are so bad in manpower terms that Ukraine is having to call up severely wounded men to assume command positions because it doesn't have healthy ones. So it doesn't look good. What they have done is that they have undertaken repeated mobilizations since the conflict began in February last year. And some of these mobilized men have now been sent through crash courses in Europe and in Britain, and they've been trained up to a certain level. But sometimes the level of training is just a couple of weeks long, and they're having to operate equipment like, Western tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, which Ukraine has no experience using. So, yes, a force has been assembled. It's said to number around 50,000 men, which in this war is not a huge number. But anyway, they have a force. It has some level of training. It has some level of equipment. But most people who look at it feel that it's fragile, that it could easily break down in the face of determined resistance. It's very short of ammunition. The West has not been able to keep up with Ukraine's needs for shells. And of course, it doesn't have proper air cover or air defenses or all of those things. So that's why you hear stories that Ukraine must win its offensive within 24 hours, achieve a breakthrough, paralyze the Russian leadership, panic the Russian military. Paralyze the Russian leadership, maybe by taking out Putin. Maybe that was what that was all about.
Or the propaganda.
Yeah. All the propaganda of it, but exactly. But I mean, when people are talking like that, when they're talking in that kind of way, then frankly, it doesn't look terribly optimistic about what's coming.
I likened it last night to the Doolittle Raid after, of course, the attack on Pearl Harbor. You know, the Americans needed some sort of a morale boost. Why have you not struck Tokyo? Well, we couldn't. We can't. We don't have the capabilities to do it. And even if we do it, it's a suicide mission. And so we launched some drones at the Kremlin and tried to take out a flag. And then the post office releases a commemorative stamp as a sort of morale boosting PR movement. That's the way it struck me as well. And maybe it'll have the desired result.
That is exactly what it was, I think, principally. And it's a sign of weakness, ultimately, not a sign of strength. I think that's an important thing for people to understand. That doesn't make it any less reckless or dangerous. And going back to your earlier point about the Russians blaming the Americans for all of this, I mean, in a way, the Russians are saying to the Americans, look, you may say you've got nothing to do with it. Prove it to us. You have been supporting this regime all this time. It is doing these things. If you are saying you don't support this kind of thing, then show us, prove to us that this isn't so by taking steps, real steps, to distance yourself from the government in Kiev and perhaps taking some steps to look for a diplomatic settlement. And of course, the US won't be able to do that. And again, as I said, the Russians will be communicating all that to their friends and of course to people inside Russia itself.
And I'll get you out of here on this, Alexander, which is if this spring offensive is about to launch and all signs maybe seem to be pointing in that direction, perhaps, why are you struck? I'm just curious what your thoughts are in having the president of Ukraine not in the country at all right now.
Well, this is an extraordinary move. And I have to say, I do wonder, and I wonder whether many people also wonder whether perhaps he's been taken out of the way in case the Russians did respond to this attack on the Kremlin with some kind of act against the decision-making centers, against Zelensky himself, in other words, in Kiev. I don't for a moment think that that's what the Russians would do, but people in Kiev might have been worried about that. So get the president out of the way, get him out of the country. But there might be another reason. And I have to say this, there's been an awful lot of political instability in Kiev. There was lots of people being sacked a few months ago, weeks ago. We never quite got to the bottom of that story. There's reports that Zelensky himself has been pushed in one direction, pushed in another direction. There was a rather sad article in the London Times which said that the people around him have been trying to seek peace, that they're talking between themselves in the evening about peace. He, after all, called the Chinese president Xi Jinping to talk about peace. And then, of course, in the morning, because there were all the pressures they're coming under from their own hardliners, from people in Washington, they have to again talk about war and make all these extreme things. So I wonder whether he's been taken out of the way because he is becoming so compromised and his position is becoming so complicated. There isn't a view somewhere, either within Kiev or perhaps among some of Ukraine's friends in the West, that keeping Zelensky in Kiev at this critical time is simply going to complicate the decision-making process even more and make it even more complicated and difficult to operate than it is already.
I guess getting out of the country and going to the other decision-making places in Berlin is probably maybe a better headquarters for what you're doing right now. Alexander, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you here. Please watch, listen, read everything you can that Alexander puts out along with the great team at the Duran. We really appreciate you joining us here on Redacted. Thank you so much.
And thank you, and my great pleasure.
Thank you so much for watching this segment here at Redacted. We are live every day at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, trying to share the stories that the mainstream media will not cover. You should also come over and join our community of Redacted Rebels over at redacted.inc. That's our private locals community where we can share exclusive content that we simply cannot share here on YouTube. Come over and join the rebellion together right now by going to redacted.inc. We'll see you next time.